The sun beat down on the driveway as the big moving truck backed up to the new house. After 15 long years working his way up in law enforcement and making history as the county's first black sheriff just 3 months ago, Ray finally had the keys to his dream home. The 2-story brick house sat in Oak Ridge, one of those fancy neighborhoods where the grass always looked perfect and where people got letters if their mailbox was the wrong shade of brown. Moving day was always a mess. Boxes were stacked on the front lawn waiting to be carried inside. The movers grunted as they hauled the heavy furniture down the truck ramp. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, curious about who was joining their community. Ray stood in the driveway, checking items off his list, dressed in an old t-shirt and worn jeans. Clothes for hard work, not for making impressions. His phone rang. It was his deputy calling about paperwork that needed signing. "I'll stop by the office tomorrow morning," Ray promised, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Right now, I've got to get my life out of these boxes." The movers had just placed his grandmother's antique dining table on the front lawn when he heard someone clear their throat loudly behind him. Ray turned around to see 2 middle-aged men standing with their arms crossed. One was tall and thin with a permanent frown etched on his face. The other was shorter with a round belly pushing against a shirt that had "CCURITA" printed across the chest in bold letters. Both wore dark blue uniforms that, at a quick glance, might be mistaken for police gear. They had patches on their shoulders with Oak Ridge HOA stitched in gold thread. The shorter one had a flashlight, handcuffs, and what looked like pepper spray hanging from his belt, trying hard to look official. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Ray asked, offering a friendly smile despite his exhaustion. The taller man didn't return the smile. "Your moving truck is blocking part of the street, which is against community guidelines. And all these boxes on the lawn are an eyesore." Ray looked at the truck. It was pulled as far to the side as possible, leaving plenty of room for cars to pass. The boxes on the lawn would be gone by evening. "I understand," Ray said politely. "We're moving as quickly as we can. Everything should be cleared up by dinner time." The shorter man stepped forward, hand resting on his belt near the handcuffs. "We're going to need to see some ID. You can't just move in here without proper clearance from the Homeowners Association." Ray raised an eyebrow. "Clearance?" "I closed on this house last week. I have all the paperwork inside." "Well, nobody told us," the taller man said, his voice getting louder. "And we're the ones who keep this neighborhood safe and orderly. We need to verify you belong here." One of the movers, a young guy with tattoos on his arms, stopped carrying a box to watch the scene unfold. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Look," Ray said calmly, "I'm just trying to move into my new home. I've paid my dues to the HOA already. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," the shorter man said, taking a step closer. "Either show us your ID right now, or we'll have to detain you for trespassing." Ray noticed a couple walking their dog had stopped to stare. Another neighbor had come out onto their porch, phone in hand, possibly recording the whole thing. The movers had stopped working entirely now, watching nervously as the situation grew more tense. Ray took a deep breath. 15 years in law enforcement had taught him how to handle difficult people, but he never expected to use those skills on his very first day in his new neighborhood. Little did these self-important men know that they were threatening the wrong person. Ray's badge and ID were in his wallet, tucked in his back pocket. But something told him to wait just a moment before revealing exactly who they were trying to intimidate. The 2 men in their makeshift uniforms stood like they owned the street. The taller one took a step forward, his shoe crushing a dandelion that had dared to grow through a crack in the sidewalk. "Let me make this perfectly clear," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm Brooks and this is Tanner. We're the official security team for Oak Ridge, and you're currently breaking at least 3 community guidelines." Ray glanced at his watch. He'd been a homeowner in this neighborhood for exactly 4 hours, and already he was being hassled. The movers had completely stopped working now, standing awkwardly beside the truck. One of them, an older guy with gray at his temples, gave Ray a look that said, "Want us to step in?" Ray gave a tiny shake of his head. He'd handled worse situations than 2 power-hungry neighborhood watchmen. "Which guidelines exactly am I breaking?" Ray asked, keeping his voice steady and polite. Tanner pulled out a small notebook with an HOA logo on it and began reading in an official-sounding voice. Section 4, Paragraph 2. No moving vehicles may obstruct any portion of the community roadways. Section 7, Paragraph 5. Lawn areas must remain free of debris and personal items at all times. And Section 12, Paragraph 1. All new residents must check in with HOA security before occupying the premises. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered now, watching from a safe distance. Ray noticed a woman in a floral dress nudge her husband and whisper something. The husband frowned and shook his head. "I wasn't aware of that last rule," Ray said calmly. "The real estate agent gave me all the community guidelines, and I don't recall seeing anything about checking in with security." Brooks laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Well, that's unfortunate for you. Ignorance of the rules doesn't excuse breaking them." Tanner's hand was still hovering near the handcuffs on his belt. "We're going to need you to move that truck immediately and clean up this mess. Then you'll need to come with us to the community office to register properly." Ray noticed something odd about their uniforms. The patches weren't professionally made. The stitching was uneven, and the lettering was slightly crooked. These weren't official uniforms. They looked homemade. "May I see your identification?" Ray asked. "What authority do you have to enforce these rules?" The question seemed to catch them off guard. Brooks and Tanner exchanged glances. "We don't need to show you anything," Brooks said, his face turning slightly red. "We represent the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association." Ray stood a little straighter. Representing the HOA is different from having law enforcement authority. "Do you work for a licensed security company?" Tanner stepped closer, trying to use his size to intimidate. "Listen here, buddy. We've been keeping this neighborhood safe for 8 years. We don't need some newcomer questioning our authority." A car slowed down as it passed, the driver rubbernecking to see what was happening. The crowd of onlookers had grown to about 7 people now. Ray could feel the tension building, like a thunderstorm about to break. "I'm just trying to understand who I'm dealing with," Ray said. "If you're official security, you should have proper identification. If you're HOA representatives, that's different. You can report violations, but you can't detain people or make arrests." Brooks's face darkened. "We absolutely can detain trespassers. And until you prove you belong here, that's exactly what you are." Tanner nodded, adding, "We've had problems with people coming into this neighborhood who don't belong. We take security very seriously here." Ray caught the implication in their words, and so did some of the neighbors watching. An older woman in the crowd shook her head and walked away, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. "I have all my closing documents inside," Ray offered. "I'd be happy to show them to you." "Too late for that," Brooks snapped. "You've already violated multiple rules and refused to comply with security personnel. Tanner, call for backup." Tanner pulled out a walkie-talkie and pressed the button. "This is Oak Ridge Security. We need assistance at 1478 Maple Drive. Got a situation with a non-compliant individual." Ray had seen enough. These men weren't just overzealous HOA volunteers. They were deliberately impersonating law enforcement officers, from their uniforms to their equipment to their language. That wasn't just annoying, it was illegal. "Gentlemen," Ray said, his patience wearing thin, "I think you're overstepping. I'd like to speak to the actual HOA president about this." Tanner laughed. "Oh, you'll be speaking to a lot of people. Backup's on the way, and if you don't start cooperating, you might be spending your first night in the county jail instead of your new house." Little did they know that Ray was intimately familiar with the county jail, but from the other side of the bars. He reached slowly toward his back pocket, ready to end this charade once and for all. The air felt electric as Ray slowly reached for his back pocket. Before he could grab his wallet, a shiny SUV with Oak Ridge Security painted on the side in stick-on letters pulled up to the curb. A heavy-set man with a buzz cut stepped out, wearing the same type of homemade uniform as Brooks and Tanner. "What's the situation?" the newcomer asked, puffing his chest out. "Got a troublemaker here, Wilson," Tanner said, pointing at Ray. "Moving in without proper clearance and giving us attitude about it." Wilson looked Ray up and down, his eyes lingering on Ray's skin color a bit too long to be comfortable. The growing crowd of neighbors shifted uneasily. There were about 10 people watching now, some with phones held up, recording everything. I've asked to see their identification, Ray explained calmly to Wilson. I just want to know who has the authority to demand my ID or threaten to detain me. Wilson laughed. We don't answer to you, buddy. We're the ones asking the questions here. An older woman stepped forward from the crowd of neighbors. She had silver hair and wore gardening gloves, clearly interrupted from her yard work. This is ridiculous, she said loudly. You boys aren't real security. You're just Tom from the HOA board and his friends playing dress-up. Brooks turned to her, face flushed with anger. Stay out of this, Ms. Chen. We're handling a security situation. Ms. Chen crossed her arms. I've lived here for 27 years, and I've never seen such foolishness. Leave this man alone and let him move in peace. A few neighbors murmured in agreement, but others looked uncomfortable, unwilling to get involved. Ray appreciated the woman's support, but he could handle this himself. Look, Ray said reasonably, this is all just a misunderstanding. I'm the legal owner of this house. I paid for it fair and square, signed all the papers, and already sent in my first HOA dues payment. Anyone can say that, Wilson argued. We need proof. Tanner nodded enthusiastically. And even with proof, you've still violated multiple community guidelines. There are consequences for that. Brooks pulled out what looked like handcuffs from his back pocket. They weren't real police handcuffs. They were the kind you could buy at a costume shop or online. I think you need to come with us to the community office until we sort this out, Brooks said, jingling the fake cuffs. If you resist, we'll consider that threatening behavior. One of the movers, the younger guy with tattoos, stepped forward. Hey man, this doesn't seem right. You can't just cuff someone for moving into their own house. Stay back, Wilson warned, putting his hand on what looked like a can of pepper spray at his belt. This doesn't concern you. The crowd grew more restless. A man in a business suit who had been watching called out, I'm calling the real police. This is harassment. Brooks turned to the crowd. We are the real security here. Anyone interfering will be reported to that HOA board for a violation. Ray had seen enough. These men were truly dangerous, not because they had any real power, but because they believed they did. That kind of delusion could lead to someone getting hurt. Before this goes any further, Ray said firmly, I want to be very clear about something. What you're doing right now, impersonating security officers, threatening to detain a private citizen, attempting to use restraints, these actions could be considered criminal offenses. Tanner laughed nervously. Big talk from someone about to be escorted off the property. I don't think you understand the situation, Ray continued, his voice steady and authoritative. I've been more than patient, but this has gone far enough. Wilson stepped closer, trying to use his size to intimidate. No, you don't understand. In Oak Ridge, we have a certain standard. People like you need to learn to follow the rules or... People like me. Ray interrupted, his eyebrow raised. The three men exchanged glances, suddenly aware of how that sounded with so many witnesses around them. Some of those witnesses were still recording everything on their phones. New residents, Brooks clarified quickly. People who don't know our community standards. Ray nodded slowly, unconvinced. I see. Well, gentlemen, I think it's time I introduced myself properly. Finally, Ray reached for his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. The trio of self-appointed security officers watched with smug expressions, certain they were about to put this newcomer in his place. They had no idea their whole world was about to turn upside down. Ray's fingers slowly pulled out his wallet, thick black leather worn at the edges from years of use. The three security officers stood with their arms crossed, impatient smiles on their faces. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. I wanted to handle this quietly, Ray said, opening his wallet. I was hoping to meet my neighbors under better circumstances, maybe at a community barbecue or something. Just show us your ID, Brooks demanded, tapping his foot. Ray nodded and pulled out not just an ID, but a gleaming gold badge that caught the sunlight and seemed to illuminate the whole scene. Sheriff Raymond Washington, at your service. The badge wasn't just any badge, it was the county sheriff's star, the highest law enforcement position in the entire county. Wilson's mouth fell open so far you could have parked a car in it. Tanner stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Brooks froze completely, like someone had turned him into a statue. That's not real, Brooks finally stammered, but his voice had gone up about 2 octaves. Ray smiled. It's very real. I was elected 3 months ago. First day on the job was 6 weeks back. And unless I'm mistaken, you 3 are impersonating law enforcement officers, which is a felony in this state. A ripple went through the crowd of neighbors. Someone in the back started clapping slowly, and soon others joined in. Ms. Chen, a silver-haired woman, broke into a huge grin. I knew these fools would mess with the wrong person eventually, she said loudly. Wilson's face had turned the color of sour milk. We're not impersonating officers, we're just HOA security. With handcuffs and patches designed to look like police insignia, and threats to detain private citizens. Ray shook his head. The law sees that differently. Tanner quickly unclipped the fake handcuffs from his belt and shoved them in his pocket. This is all just a big misunderstanding. Oh, I understand perfectly, Ray said, his voice calm but firm. You've been bullying people in this neighborhood, using fake authority to push folks around. How many others have you threatened? How many people felt unwelcome because of you 3? Brooks found his voice again, though it was shaky. We were just following HOA guidelines, keeping the community safe. Safe from what? Ray asked. From people moving into homes they legally purchased. A man stepped forward from the crowd. He wore a button-up shirt and khaki pants. Sheriff, I'm Lee Park, the actual president of the HOA. These men don't speak for our board. We never authorized them to act as security or to confront residents like this. Brooks looked betrayed. Tom said. Tom isn't on the board anymore, Lee interrupted. He was asked to step down last month after multiple complaints. He's been telling you to do this. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. Ray had dealt with this kind of situation before in his law enforcement career, people grabbing power they didn't have, using fear to control others. Ray pulled out his phone. I need to call this in. We'll need statements from witnesses. These men have been impersonating officers and attempting to make illegal arrests. Wait, please, Wilson begged, all his bluster gone. We didn't mean any harm. We were just trying to keep the neighborhood nice. Nice for who? Ray asked pointedly. The question hung in the air. Everyone knew what it meant. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some looking at their shoes, others looking at the 3 fake officers with new understanding. Ray dialed his office. Deputy Torres, it's Sheriff Washington. I'm going to need a patrol car at 1478 Maple Drive in Oak Ridge. Yes, that's my new address. No, I'm fine, but we have 3 individuals here impersonating law enforcement officers. As Ray spoke on the phone, he watched the 3 men deflate like punctured balloons. Their fake power was gone. The neighbors were watching everything, some still recording. The truth was coming out, not just about today, but about all the times these men had bullied and intimidated people before. And Torres, Ray added, bring the camera. We need to document those uniforms and equipment before they disappear. This kind of behavior stops today. Ray ended the call and turned back to Brooks, Wilson, and Tanner. Gentlemen, I suggest you stay right where you are. We have a lot to talk about, and this time, I'll be asking the questions. 15 minutes felt like forever as everyone waited for the real police to arrive. The fake officers stood awkwardly by their SUV, not daring to leave, but clearly wishing they could disappear. The crowd of neighbors had grown even larger, with people texting friends to come see the drama unfolding on Maple Drive. Finally, a real police car with proper county markings pulled up, lights flashing but no siren. A woman in an official deputy uniform stepped out, her hand resting casually on her belt as she surveyed the scene. Her name tag read Deputy Torres. Sheriff, she said with a nod to Ray. Quite a welcome party you've got here. Ray smiled slightly, not exactly how I planned to meet the neighbors. He quickly filled her in on what had happened, pointing out the 3 men who had tried to detain him. Deputy Torres shook her head in disbelief. Seriously? They tried to arrest you? The actual sheriff. They didn't know who I was, Ray explained. That's part of the problem. They've been doing this to who knows how many people. Torres pulled out a camera and began taking photos of the men in their fake uniforms, documenting the patches, the handcuffs, and the vehicle with its stick-on lettering. Each flash of the camera made the 3 men flinch. Lee Park, the HOA president, approached Ray with an extended hand. "Sheriff Washington, I can't apologize enough for this. This is not how we treat people in Oak Ridge." Ray shook his hand. "I believe you, Mr. Park, but clearly there's been a problem brewing here for some time." Ms. Chen nodded vigorously from where she stood nearby. "Been telling the board for years that Tom and his buddies were up to no good. They've run off at least 3 families I know of." Deputy Torres pulled out a notepad. "I'll need statements from anyone who's had run-ins with these men before." Several hands went up in the crowd, more than Ray expected. Brooks finally found his voice again. "We were just volunteers trying to keep the neighborhood safe." "This is being blown way out of proportion." "Safe from what?" asked a young man from the crowd. "My family moved in last year, and you followed my dad around when he was jogging, claiming he looked suspicious. And you told my grandmother she couldn't have her church friends over because there were too many cars," added another neighbor. The stories kept coming, one after another. Ray listened carefully, seeing the pattern emerge. These men hadn't been targeting everyone. They'd been selective about who they harassed. "I think we need to take this conversation down to the station," Ray said finally. "Deputy Tars, please escort these 3 gentlemen to headquarters for formal questioning." "You're arresting us?" Wilson asked, his face pale. "Not yet," Ray clarified. "You're coming in for questioning about potential charges of impersonating law enforcement officers, harassment, and civil rights violations. Whether you're arrested depends on what we learn during the investigation." Torres began reading them their rights, just to be safe. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the 3 men who had terrorized the neighborhood for years were led to the police car. Before they left, Ray addressed the neighbors who had gathered. "Folks, I'm sorry you had to witness this today, but maybe it's a good thing it happened. Sometimes problems that have been hidden for years need to come to light before they can be fixed." Lee Park stepped forward again. "Sheriff Washington is right. The HOA board will be holding an emergency meeting tonight. This stops now. If anyone has experienced harassment from these men or anyone else in the neighborhood, we want to hear about it." Ms. Chen clapped her hands. About time. And to think, all it took was them picking on the new sheriff. There was nervous laughter from the crowd. The tension was breaking, but the issues exposed today wouldn't be fixed by one arrest or one HOA meeting. As Torres drove away with the 3 men in the back seat, the movers cautiously returned to their work, carrying Ray's furniture into the house. Neighbors began to introduce themselves properly, some apologizing for not stepping in sooner, others sharing their own stories. Ray's moving day hadn't gone as planned. His furniture was still half on the lawn, his boxes unopened. But as he looked around at his new neighbors, really saw them, their faces, their relief, their hope, he realized something important had begun here today, something that needed to continue. The community center buzzed with voices as neighbors filled every seat in the room. It had been 3 days since the incident on Ray's lawn, and word had spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. The emergency HOA meeting had to be moved from the usual conference room to the main hall to accommodate everyone who showed up. Lee Park stood at the front, tapping a microphone. "Folks, thank you for coming tonight. We have a lot to discuss." Ray sat in the back row, still feeling new despite the warm welcomes he'd received since the incident. He'd come straight from work, still wearing his sheriff's uniform. He hadn't planned to speak tonight. This was a community matter for the residents to work through, but he'd been specifically asked to attend. "Before we begin," Lee continued, "I want to apologize on behalf of the entire board. What happened to Sheriff Washington was unacceptable, but it wasn't an isolated incident. We've learned that many of you have experienced similar harassment, and we've failed to take your complaints seriously enough." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. An elderly man stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. "I've lived here for 32 years, he said, his voice shaky but determined. "My late wife and I were the 3rd black family to buy in Oak Ridge. Things weren't always easy, but they were never this bad. Those men made my grandkids afraid to visit me. Said they looked suspicious playing in my own yard." A woman in a hijab raised her hand next. "They'd followed me to my car every time I visited my sister's house. They demanded to know where I was going, who I was visiting. They wrote down my license plate number." More stories followed, each one worse than the last. Ray listened carefully, noting patterns. It wasn't just about race, though that was a big part of it. The fake security team had targeted anyone they deemed not fitting in: young couples, single parents, renters, people with accents. The 3 men involved have been charged, Ray explained when asked to speak. But criminal charges only solve part of the problem. The bigger question is how this was allowed to continue for so long. A man in the third row stood up angrily. "I complained to Tom when I was on the board 2 years ago. He said they were just being thorough. When I pushed it, suddenly, there were violation notices on my house every week until I resigned." Lee nodded grimly. Tom and his friends created a climate of fear. They controlled who was on the board, who could speak at meetings. They used HOA violations as punishment for anyone who challenged them. An older woman who'd been quietly knitting in the corner finally spoke up. "My husband and I have been here since this development was built. We've seen neighborhoods change, some for better, some for worse. But the worst change is when neighbors stop looking out for each other and start looking for reasons to push each other away." Her simple words hung in the air, profound in their truth. Another resident, a young father, raised his hand. "So what do we do now? How do we fix this?" Lee looked around the room. "We start by listening to each other, really listening. Then we rewrite the HOA bylaws to prevent this kind of abuse of power. And we create proper channels for complaints that can't be ignored or buried." Ray watched as neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before began talking in earnest. Some were angry, some tearful, but all were engaged. This wasn't just about 3 men with fake badges anymore. It was about what kind of community they wanted to be. A teacher who lived down the street from Ray's new house raised her hand. "I think we need to do more than just fix the rules. We need to rebuild trust. Maybe we could start with a real neighborhood block party? Get to know each other properly." Heads nodded around the room. Small smiles appeared on faces that had been serious all evening. As the meeting continued, Ray felt something he hadn't expected on his dramatic moving day: hope. Oak Ridge was bruised but not broken, and sometimes it took revealing an ugly truth to begin genuine healing. 6 months passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. The maple trees that lined Ray's street were changing colors, painting Oak Ridge in warm shades of red and gold. He stood in his front yard, coffee mug in hand, watching as neighbors set up tables and hung decorations for the community's 3rd monthly block party. So much had changed since that fateful moving day. The legal system had taken its course with Brooks, Wilson, and Tanner. The evidence against them had been overwhelming, not just from Ray's experience, but from dozens of residents who came forward with similar stories. Brooks and Tanner received probation, community service, and were required to complete courses on civil rights and bias. Wilson, who had the longest history of harassment and had been caught on camera threatening residents, received 6 months in county jail. Tom, the former board member who had created the fake security team, faced civil lawsuits from several families who had been harassed out of the neighborhood. Last Ray heard, Tom had sold his house and moved away, unable to face his neighbors after the truth came out. But the most remarkable changes weren't in the courts, they were right here in Oak Ridge itself. Morning Sheriff called Ms. Chen from across the street, where she was directing a group of teenagers setting up games for the younger kids. "You bringing your famous potato salad today?" Ray laughed. "You know it. Wouldn't miss it." He'd become something of a local celebrity, though not in the way he'd expected. The county newspaper had run a story about the incident, but what caught people's attention wasn't just the confrontation, it was what happened afterward. The Oak Ridge HOA had completely restructured. The new board, elected in a record turnout vote, was the most diverse in the community's history. Lee Park remained as president, working alongside representatives from every section of the neighborhood. The old rulebook, filled with nitpicky regulations that had been selectively enforced, was thrown out. The new guidelines focused on safety, inclusion, and mutual respect. The security team was replaced with a genuine neighborhood watch program, properly trained and supervised, with clear limits on their role. Ray had helped design the training program himself, teaching volunteers how to actually keep their communities safe without overstepping boundaries or abusing power. "Uncle Ray." A small voice called out as a young boy ran up his driveway. It was little Carter from 3 doors down. Not really his nephew, of course, but all the neighborhood kids called him Uncle Ray now. "Hey buddy," Ray smiled, high-fiving the boy. "Ready for the party?" "Mom says to tell you we need your tables," Carter explained importantly, "and to bring extra ice." "You tell her I'll be right there," Ray promised. The boy dashed off, weaving between neighbors carrying food dishes and folding chairs toward the blocked-off street. Ray went inside to grab his contribution to the party. His house finally felt like home now, pictures on the walls, furniture arranged just right. Through his kitchen window, he could see the growing crowd of neighbors, all colors, all ages, talking and laughing together. He thought about how close he'd come to moving away after that first awful day. The thought had crossed his mind more than once as he'd unpacked those first few boxes. Why stay where he wasn't wanted? But something had told him to stick it out, to be part of the change rather than another victim of the problem. And the community had surprised him, rising to the challenge in ways he couldn't have imagined. As Ray stepped back outside with his potato salad and a bag of ice, he nodded to himself. This was what real community safety looked like, not fake badges and intimidation, but neighbors who knew each other's names, who looked out for one another, who celebrated together. "Hey, Sheriff," called Lee from down the street. "We're about to start the speeches. Everyone wants to hear from you." Ray smiled and shook his head. He wasn't one for speeches, but as he walked toward the gathering, he knew exactly what he wanted to say. This wasn't just a story about fake security guards getting their comeuppance. It was about a community that had faced its problems honestly and chosen to be better. And that was something worth celebrating.